Henry is a strophic ballad, and it was written by George Bridgetower, of course. It was written shortly after he graduated from his undergrad at Cambridge, his music degree. And it's essentially about a woman, presumably the princess that he wrote it for, and she is essentially speaking to her lover, who is not convinced that she has been faithful or is truly in love with her. And the song is essentially her just trying to plead with Henry, her love, and convince him that her love for him is true. I love the form of it because the first verse is essentially her saying, "Look, you're always calling me fickle. You're always, not believing in me, but I'm always here for you." The second verse is her trying to convince him. She's like, other men give me compliments and stuff, but it's only when you give me compliments that my cheeks flush, that I actually blush, because I only care for you, Henry. And the third one is like her truly declaring her love for him. At the end of each verse, she goes, "Henry, Henry," and she's just calling out to his name, which I love because each time the music repeats, the verses are different, but at the end, it's always Henry that she's calling out to. The idea of sound in general is just very intriguing to me. A lot of times we look at sounds as like either pretty or ugly or tense or relaxing, consonant or dissonant. But all sounds to me have a really beautiful quality to them. And so it doesn't always help me to start in the sound world. And so a lot of times I start in a more abstract world, which is visual art. And so when I start composing, I usually will draw out the ideas, the shapes, and the types of emotions that I'm feeling with the music. And this is especially the case with music that is tied to like a concrete story, like the Resilient Sounds project that we worked on. When I was hearing the refugee story, I could hear certain ideas based on the imagery that he was giving me. And so from being able to draw out those ideas and those kind of abstract feelings, I'm able to translate that into musical shape and musical ideas. And then from there, I usually will actually draw out my kind of like picture as like a timeline on staff paper. And so when I see that on the staff paper, then that actually gives me sort of a visual flow of how the music should be shaped and how I should be kind of constructing these ideas, and where are like pillar points, where are these moments of release, these moments of kind of calm, and where should the music be more active. It kind of visually just guides me from there, and then that allows my ear to then attach the many sounds that are in my world to these different ideas. One of the difficult things about interacting with Bridgetower is that his biography is so incomplete. There are so many holes in it, and him as like a very obscure composer, even though in his time he was rather prolific, kind of highlights one of the things that I think is so interesting about the way that we preserve music. One of the key ways that Mozart is beautiful is that it's not just that his music is beautiful, but it's a beauty that's in danger, because there's always the potential that it could be lost to history, right? Which is something that happened to Bridgetower's music. We only have a handful of his works left. Most of his biography is composed of secondhand accounts or apocryphal stories, and so we don't really have a good idea of what his life was, because his biography did kind of succumb to this thing that we always are seeing as a danger for classical music. And so it was a really interesting perspective that I was able to see through the way that his work kind of failed to be captured in history. And that was kind of something that I wanted to capture in the piece, the way that he was this obscure figure despite having been prolific in his lifetime. Yeah, I'm recently out of my undergrad for music, and kind of my career is starting to kick off and take some more momentum, and that's kind of like where Bridgetower was, because he was a little bit older. He was running his 30s when he wrote Henry, but he had just come out of his music degree at Cambridge, and he was starting to be able to write for royalty, and he had played in professional orchestra, and so we're both kind of these like young composers and who are kind of starting to pick up steam and kind of find our own pace and our own voice in the world that we're seeing. And then just like Bridgetower, I've received a lot of support and people who believe in me, and so I understand what it's like to be a composer who is at the same time an outcast, but also being brought into this world. So it's interesting. So the Rachmaninoff is a very important piece in just like the way that I conceptualized my relationship with Bridgetower, primarily because the idea of time in music and the way that we can try to convey that just really fascinates me. And I thought that Rachmaninoff had a very interesting approach to that whenever he wrote his Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini, which is essentially a theme and variations in its form, but it has a narrative similar to more like a tone poem. And what he's doing is he's conveying his relationship to Paganini, who's a composer and violinist who came before him. And Rachmaninoff finds he identifies very heavily with Paganini because Paganini's was considered like this sort of devilish violinist, and he had this very macabre sense to him. And Rachmaninoff had similar projections onto him, where he was, because of his skill on the piano, that he had maybe a deal with the devil to get his skill.
Huge hands, right?
Yeah. And so one of the ways that he ties it in is not just by using the music from the Paganini, but he also ties in the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath from the Mass. And so he essentially crafts a narrative that looks at his relationship across time with this composer Paganini, and kind of creating a relationship where he explores these ideas of darkness and love within their music and how they're connected. And that's kind of one of the ideas that I wanted to explore with kind of referencing the Bridgetower and turning that into this sort of variation. Is that on the surface it is like a theme and variations, but it is more of a tone poem where there is this narrative across time that looks at these various elements of Bridgetower's music in history. And so essentially what I'm doing is using Bridgetower's music as like a screen to project my own thoughts and concerns as a composer of the 21st century, and acknowledging our connection as two Black composers in the classical music world, and kind of our struggles and how they're both similar but also different, and the way that the struggles have changed over time. Namely, the way that racism in music has kind of evolved into a new shape and a new form. And so, just if I was to break down the piece, there are essentially three main variations that I write. The way the piece starts is I actually use the original orchestration of the song, and so it's essentially just the one verse, and so I use the orchestration that sounds it's just going to have a very classical sound to it. And then once we move into the first true variation, what I've done is essentially stripped away a lot of the elements of the Bridgetower and use those component parts as as not just the basis for the musical material, but kind of change the way that they relate to the music itself. And so the music has this sort of Beethoven feel with these kind of heavier gestures and these kind of very stark juxtapositions. And it's always based on the Bridgetower, but in certain ways they're going to be obstructed. And the idea that I was thinking about here was this idea that Beethoven was kind of this main figure from this period of music, right? But Western music has always been supported by the underrepresented musicians, not just musicians of color, but musicians who identify as queer, women, people from East and Central Asia, and they've all kind of contributed to the Western musical tradition. But in this way, they've also been obscured out of Western music. And so the first variation is called Extortion, to take this idea about how Bridgetower and other composers of color were essentially fundamental to helping Western music be what it is, but they've been obscured by these kind of titanic figures, which is how the music rolls, where the bass line is based on the chord progression from the Bridgetower. There's, like I said, the Henry motive is in. All the motives are cycled in different ways in the order that they came in the song, but they're always obscured in some sort of way to have them being transformed because they're essentially supporting this new idea of Western music. The second movement is called Exclusion and is based on the idea that Bridgetower, like many others, were excluded from the kind of Western canon and Western music history. And so as the piece goes on, there are these very stark kind of pointillistic moments that are, again, based on fragments of the Henry, the original Bridgetower, but as it goes along, it becomes more chaotic and gradually starts to grow as the realization of Bridgetower as a figure in history starts to grow, until it eventually has this climax and this breaking point, which leads into the third movement, which is called Revival, where we start getting this more momentum to actually bring back the original themes and the original ideas of Bridgetower in the original key. And it ends in this more triumphal, kind of celebratory finale, which would be kind of similar to like a finale in like a symphony from his time, but it's not necessarily a finale over the triumph over racism, but I consider it as a triumph in the spirit to fight it. And so it's not just that this racism has persisted and suppressed and oppressed voices like Bridgetower and other musicians of color, but that they've also persisted in their fight and that they're continuing the fight today. And so it's a celebration of their strength to continue fighting even after centuries of suppression, oppression, and discrimination to kind of be whited out of history. Yeah, and I think that's one of the ways that music has kind of changed over history, is that at a point of time, when Bridgetower and Beethoven were writing music was more individualistic, especially starting from like the Baroque period up through the 19th century, where composers could write music for the sake of just creating art, right? But history has shown us that there is danger in that. And I think it's very important for composers today to make sure that they're putting some sort of extra musical meaning or association with their music in order to keep their music from being weaponized or used in ways that they didn't intend to. And so for me personally, it's very important that I'm always putting some sort of political statement or really concrete idea into my music so that it functions the way that I want it to, and that it's also prevented from working against the causes that I want it to, if that makes sense. I think like a historical example would be the way that Beethoven's music was used during the Blitzkrieg. He would never have condoned his music. If he knew that, he would never want his music to be played again. But the way that the composer was kind of put center, and there wasn't necessarily this association with his music that could prevent it from being used in that way. We know that it's a potential and it's a danger, but it can also be something that could give us incredible hope. And knowing that music does have that kind of power, we can use it to create good in the world and instill progress and help people to feel empowered and feel hope and, realize that we can change the world through music. Obviously, the standard in Western music is that, white men are the primary producers of art and music. And so when you have somebody like me or Bridgetower, someone of color who is producing music, there is this sense of exoticism that's associated with what we're doing. And a lot of times when you're somebody like Bridgetower, who is a composer of color, so he doesn't fit into the standard mold, but he is also being seen as exceptional from the group that he is part of, people of color. There is this kind of way that he's isolated and singled out because he doesn't fit in necessarily to the white men of history who are creating art, but he's also being singled out from the group that he's part of because he's seen as exceptional in some way to the normal inferior people of color. And so there is this way that when you're a composer of color, you are put into a very isolated group, and it can be both lonely and also incredibly difficult, because then you're essentially carrying the weight of a whole race on your back, because you're essentially seen within one group as this, you're seen as both the representation of an entire group and also an exceptional exclusionary figure within that group. So it can be, from personal experience, really difficult to try to cope with that and understand how you kind of take on that role, because it's a hard role to try to fill, to feel like you're the only one fighting for your art and what you believe in and how you want to express it. And I have a weird kind of personal relationship with the African American history, because like Bridgetower, I'm actually of British descent. And so my family, I'm first generational in America. My family's from England. But having been born in this country, I didn't inherit the African American historical experience. I was adopted into it, where I was born an African American, but I know that my ancestors weren't slaves in this country. And so I know that every time I'm producing art, I'm coming from one tradition but representing another. And so there's this kind of bipolar distinction I have to create within my art, where I know that my historical experience isn't the same as others, but I have to capture theirs, because whether I want to or not, I'm going to be representative of that. It's just one of those. It's another one of those things that just makes you realize the scope and complexity of the history that we thought we knew so much about. Because I think one of the things that growing up, as I started to see more and more white composers as like the standard for history, it was just always my assumption that there just weren't black composers, that there weren't female composers, that there weren't composers from these underrepresented groups. But then you start to realize that there's always been this really complex and nuanced way that history has whitewashed what we're seeing. That there is intentional preservation of certain composers in order to take away the worth of other composers. We still play Beethoven's music because Beethoven's a genius, right? But what makes Bridgetower not a genius when he was a prodigy at his time? And then, in the Baroque period, there were actually more women composing than there were in the classical period. And so what happened, where we go from a period where there are women being educated in music composition, and then there's fewer and fewer, it makes you realize that at the same time that there has been racial progress, that there's also been racist progress, and that at the same time that we are having these different ways that we become more free, racism is still fighting against that and becoming more nuanced, more complex and sophisticated as a way to become a more insidious part of our culture. If we're gonna only try to look at the historical music by underrepresented composers, then we're looking at a very minuscule and finite amount of music compared to the vast array of music that exists in the Western tradition. And so what we have to consider is, if we're taking just like U.S. history, right? It's a 400-year-long history if we're considering from like colonial times, and the majority of that, people of color were slaves for 250 years. And then in that last 150 years that they weren't slaves, 100 of those were Jim Crow. And so we're talking a very small sliver of history where, we've had true like legal freedom to compose and try to catch up. And so if we take that perspective into music, we have this vast array of music by white male composers, and then this very small amount of music by people who are underrepresented. And now we're saying, okay, we're going to try to play more of that music today. And we see people across the country, across the world, trying to play more of that music. But what has happened in history, it is easier now for a composer of color to, compose music in the concert setting. And so, yes, those pieces are growing. But at the same time, it's also easier for white composers to play music. And so it's not just that there's this disparity between the number of pieces, it's that it's growing. And so even if there are more pieces by Black composers, we need to put more of an effort into making sure there's more commissions, that we're supporting more of those artists and really trying to create more equity in the musical world. And I think one of the hopes that I have for this piece is that it does shed light on the way that history is complex and the way that it is hard to kind of accept and deal with, especially when you hear words like racism. Certain people hear that word and they close their hearts immediately, or they try to defend against it. But when we acknowledge and try to find a way to actually define that term in a meaningful way, then we can really start to accept what has happened in history. And even if we can't rectify something for somebody like Bridgetower, we can still honor his legacy by trying to open more hearts and trying to really support composers of color and do more projects like this.